Today we're installing a Madjax 5-inch drop axle lift kit designed for an E-Z-GO TXT. Included in the kit is a drop axle itself, new spindles, rear blocks, rear spacers, rear brackets, 4 U-bolts, hardware, and thread locking adhesive. Now let's get started. First thing we need to do is engage your park brake and lift the cart up on jack stands. We've also removed our front tires as well as our dust cap. Now that we have that removed, we're going to remove this cotter pin using a pair of pliers and retain. We're going to repeat this process on the other side. Now that our cotter pin is removed, we're going to back off our spindle hub nut and retain. You're going to retain your hub and nut. Now we want to loosen the nut on our tie rod all the way to the end, and then before we completely remove it, we're going to go to the other side and do the same. You want to keep the nut on the end of the threads just so it holds the tie rod in place so we can loosen the passenger side. You're going to remove your tie rod and retain. Now that we have the tie rod and the hub removed, we're going to remove the rack and pinion from our spindle. First thing we want to do is remove the cotter pin. Be sure to retain hardware. Now that you have your rack and pinion removed from your spindle, we can remove our front axle. For video purposes, we're going to remove the spindles from the front axle. You do not have to do this. You can take the whole piece off at one time and save yourself a step. Now we're ready to remove our front axle. First, we're going to start on the 3 bolts that hold the rack and pinion in. First one here with the spacer. There's one right behind this one with a spacer as well. Then you have your front one that has a spacer and a nut. We're going to start on the far side. You want to retain your hardware. Now we're going to remove the front bolt and spacer. You can pull your rack and pinion and set it on your front springs. You can finish taking the hardware off of your front axle. You're going to have to remove your spring plates to get this front bolt out. Before we go any further, I want to walk through your rack and pinion hardware. The front bolt that sits on the passenger side of the rack and pinion has a large spacer with 2 washers and a nut. The rear bolt that sits closest to the middle of the cart has a large spacer, 1 washer, and a nut. And your front bolt on the driver's side has a small spacer, a washer, a nut, another washer, and then the rack and pinion sits on top of that. You have 2 more washers that go on top of the rack and pinion, and finally your nut. Now that we have our rack and pinion removed from our front axle, we're going to remove the 2 rear spring plate bolts and retain. You need to keep your front shocks attached to your axle. This will prevent it from falling down while you're removing your spring plates. Now we're going to remove the 3 passenger side spring plate bolts. Now that we have both sides loosened, we can remove our last bolt. Now we're going to remove our shocks, retain our hardware, and we're going to repeat this process on the other side. You want to push your shock up and out of the way. Now we're going to move on to the driver's side. Now that we have our factory axle removed, we're going to install our Mad-Jack's drop axle lift. You want to tuck it up under the front cover and set the lift on top of your springs. Bring your shock down and reattach your shock to your new drop axle using the hardware provided. We're going to go ahead and attach both shocks now. Now that we have our drop axle attached to our shocks, we're going to install the long bolt that goes towards the front of the drop axle that attaches the rack and pinion to the axle itself. We're going to install that before we attach our spring plates. This is the bolt that has the small spacer. Then the washer. And then the regular nut. Go ahead and get this bolt into place before you do any of the plates. Once you attach the spring plates, you will not be able to get this bolt into place. Once you have this bolt tightened, then you can install your spring plates. Now we're going to attach our passenger side spring plate. We're going to install the driver's side as well, and then we'll tighten our hardware. Now we're going to tighten our hardware. Now we're going to attach our rack and pinion. Now you're going to take your rack and pinion. You want to put your washer over the top of your nut. And place your rack and pinion over the front bolt, just like this. Then we're going to take our other washer and our last nut and go over the top of the bolt. Before we tighten, we want to install our other two rack and pinion bolts. These are the ones with the big spacers. This is the one with two washers on top. And finally the last spacer in the back. Now that all our hardware is in place, we can tighten. Now that we have our drop axle attached to the cart, we can install our spindles. We're going to start by attaching our driver's side spindle. Does not matter which side you start on. Once you have it in place, you can go ahead and tighten. Now that we have our spindle attached, we can reinstall our tie rod. Now we're going to repeat this process on the passenger side. Now we're going to attach our rack and pinion to the top of our spindle and tighten. Don't forget to replace your cotter pin. Now we're ready to install our hubs. Now we're going to tighten our hub, reinstall our cotter pin, and repeat this process on the driver's side. Now that we have our hubs and our cotter pins reattached, we can reinstall our dust cap covers and put on our tires. Now that we have our front tires attached, we're moving on to the back of the lift. When installing your rear lift kit, you may have to remove the brake cable from the brake cable anchor to give yourself more slack. You'll see that we removed our factory tires. We've also placed the cart up on jack stands and blocked the front wheels. To get started, we're going to remove the spring plate bolts at the front and the back of the spring. The shock, we're going to just loosen the nut. You don't want to take it completely off, as well as the U-bolts. We're going to loosen those nuts all the way to the end, but do not remove them. This is going to help hold the motor in place. Be sure to retain your spring hardware. Now that we have everything loosened, we can now install the driver's side block. Now that we're on the driver's side, you'll notice that we have supported the rear axle with a lift. This is to keep it in place, because as soon as you start loosening up these bolts, the motor's going to want to fall out or move. You may have to loosen up the brake cable on the driver's side as well. Refer to your manufacturer's instructions on how to do this. So we're going to do the same thing we did on the passenger side. We're going to remove the spring bolts. We're going to fully remove the U-bolts and the shock bolt on this side. You do not have to retain the U-bolts, but you do want to retain the shock nut as well as the spring bolts. Now that we have all of our factory hardware removed, we're going to reattach our spring above the rear axle using the retained hardware. Make sure that both bolts are in place before you tighten. Now before we put our blocks on, I want to explain the spacer to you. The spacer has to do with the rear spring. If your spring has more than 2 leaves in it, then you don't need a spacer. If it has 2, then you'll put the spacer on top of the rear block. Now we're going to put our rear block in. You'll notice the hole on the top of the rear block. This goes on the nut that's under the bottom of your springs. So we're going to place that on top of your axle and use your lift to put your axle in place and line up your nut with your hole on top of your block. Now that we have our rear block lined up with our spring, we're going to attach our rear bracket. You'll notice on the bracket that the tab that comes off the edge needs to be towards the inside of the cart. This is where your shock will mount. Also, you'll notice that the tab has an angle pointing up. This is the driver's side. Set it on top of the bolt on top of your spring. Pull your shock down and reattach it with the hardware we retained from earlier. You don't want to fully tighten up the shock. This is where it holds it in place. Now we're going to install our U-bolts through the top of our bracket, through our block into the bottom of our axle. Once both the U-bolts are in place, you can use the hardware provided in your kit and tighten the U-bolts. Now that we have our U-bolts in place, we're going to move on to the passenger side. Now that we have our driver's side block installed, we're going to go ahead and remove the shock bolt as well as the U-bolts and put our spring on top of the rear axle. Now we're going to put our spring on top of our rear axle, just like we did on the driver's side. We're going to drop our lift down a little bit. And reattach our spring using the retained hardware. Now we're ready to install our rear block. Again, you want to be sure that your nut on the bottom of your spring lines up with the hole on top of your block. Once that's accomplished, we're going to take our rear bracket. Now you want to pull your shock down through your tab on your bracket and reinstall your shock hardware that we retained from earlier. You can tighten this hardware once your U-bolts are in place. Just like we did on the driver's side, you want to take your U-bolts down through the top of your bracket. Once both bolts are in place, then you can use your supplied hardware to tighten your U-bolts. Now that we have our U-bolts and our shock tightened, you'll notice that we've attached our Mad-Jax wheels and tires. Now that we have our lift kit installed, we're going to work on our alignment. To do this, we're going to pull a tape across the front of the tires on the inside, and then we're going to do the same thing on the back side of that tire. What we're looking for is about 1/4 to 3/8 inch wider in the front than the rear. This is going to help with stability, and it's per Mad-Jax specifications. Now we have our cart lifted in place and our parking brake is engaged. What you want to do is loosen the nut on the tie rod and you're going to spin this tie rod either forward or backwards depending on whether the front or the rear needs to come in or out. On our cart in particular, the rear needs to come in, so we're going to rotate it towards the back of the cart. Once you're satisfied with your distance, tighten the nut back up. We're going to drop the cart back down, pull it forward 10 to 15 feet, and check our measurement again. Now that you pulled your cart 10 to 15 feet forward, you want to remeasure your front toe in. If it's per Mad-Jax specifications, we can move on to the next step. If it is not, repeat the last step. Next, we're going to align our steering wheel by loosening the nut on the steering rack rod and spinning the rod until our steering wheel is straight and our tires are straight. Once that's complete, we're finished installing our Mad-Jax lift kit designed for an E-Z-GO TXT.